The Joyful Friar podcast is made possible by the generous support of our friends. To support the podcast, please visit nathan-castle.com and donate today. Hi, and welcome to this episode of the Joyful Friar podcast. I'm Father Nathan Castle, your host. Today's episode is part 2 in a trilogy of Ritah and Afterlife Rehab. That's chapter 9 in the current book, Afterlife Uninterrupted, book 3, Please Let Me Explain. I'm excited today because in preparation for one of these, I go back and read the chapter again and pray with the person, and get ideas and get the Spirit moving inside me. And today I was able to do that by listening to the audiobook version of book 3. The book came out in December. It's now late June. And we started almost right away, right after the first of the year, after Christmas and New Year's, to do the audiobook. That meant a number of the prayer partners flying into Tucson to do that in person, and some of it remotely. A lot of work on the part of several different people. And finally, today, it's all the way through the finish line. I was able to download it on my iPhone and listen to it. So I'm happy about that. Last week's episode was introducing the story of Ritah with an H and Afterlife Rehab. If you recall, she showed me in a dream being in a car in a sad scene with parents and her parents and a Christmas present, a wrapped gift. So it had something of family and celebration in it, but it had a tone of sadness, and it was Christmas. Anyway, it turned out that she had a decades-long history of addiction, and her parents had paid for, I think, 3 different residential rehabs. She was just never really free of addiction. There were sometimes were better than others, but the scene that she showed me was not her death. It was a scene that preceded her death, maybe by several months, 3 months maybe. But her parents had told her, we are going to invite you to our home for a dinner, just the 3 of us, and a simple gift exchange, but we won't be inviting you to the larger extended family Christmas because we'd all like to have a Christmas without your addictions. So that was the sadness in it. She told us that she didn't really like the phrase tough love, but her parents weren't being unkind. They were just setting definite boundaries, and that's the way things were going to be. She did die in addiction of a street drug several months later, but that was the scene that she chose to show in a dream, and that got us started praying for her and helping her along. Today's episode is a compassionate response, and I'll follow it up with next week's will be a spiritual practice that comes to mind from the story that Ritah presented to us. Remember, we always have one encounter with the person where we first meet them and help them move along. And then the second one, we go back and ask their permission if we want to make their story known in a book or on a podcast or something. So we have those 2. Today's podcast has to do with a compassionate response to Ritah's story. I was looking around, and compassion is an important idea to me, and I know it means to suffer with, but I came across a quote from St. Thomas Aquinas, in whom I'm schooled a lot. This happened to be from a daily that I get from Matthew Fox, who was a Dominican for more than 35 years, and is an Episcopal priest who has a great love for Thomas Aquinas from his training as a Dominican. He had this to say, I found this just this week, that Aquinas taught that compassion is to have a heart that suffers from the misfortune of others because we think of that suffering as our own. I'm going to repeat that. According to Thomas Aquinas, compassion is to have a heart that suffers from the misfortune of others because we think of that misfortune as our own. It also makes us eager to repel the misfortune of others if we're able. Lots of people tried to come to the help of Ritah. I don't think that was wasted, even though, her life ended in an overdose death. I like to think that anything that we do out of love for another is not wasted, even if we don't get the result that we wish we had. Because if it's love, love just can't be obliterated. Love is strong. We met in our, when we go into prayer, we first protect ourselves with the support of the angels and the saints. And then very often we meet the guardian angel of the person that will be assisting that day, and we ask them to give us a little clarity because dreams, by their nature, can have some indistinctness about them, symbology or something. So we always ask for a guardian to kind of on the line first. I allow them to speak through me to the prayer partners. And her guardian took the name Earl. Earl told us that the one that he guards, Ritah, has a great aptitude for receiving the truth, which is no minor detail in the life of somebody whose whole consciousness was overshadowed by addiction so consistently. If you know anything about addiction, you know that that denial is denial of the truth is a huge component of it. But he said, no, Ritah has a great aptitude for receiving the truth. She mentioned that one of the things that she's enjoying in the afterlife as she moves through a healing process is that not all of the healing has to do with going back and re-examining and understanding past events, that some of the healing is simply that her consciousness is receiving new material. I wonder if you've seen that in your own life. I've had plenty of things where I was troubled by something and was, appropriately trying to figure out what went wrong and what could I have done differently and so on. But then if you are open to the blessing of each day, even though there might be unresolved troubles from the recent or even distant past, the new day can present happy things. It can present joys and creative projects, things that fill your consciousness with positive things that haven't to do with trying to recover from some unpleasant past event. She was just saying that she was enjoying that aspect of her afterlife, that there was everything new that was happening to her was pleasant. And so she wasn't having to just deal with addiction. And she mentioned self-loathing, that one of her issues in her addiction was self-loathing, that she was harming people, disappointing people, wasting their money, down on herself. She went back into the story that she presented to us in a dream, and she reiterated that she didn't believe that her parents were unkind. And she said that since her death, no one has been unkind to her. Even people in the afterlife, when they bring up to her truths that can be unflattering, difficult to deal with, she said, anytime people brought up to me something, it was only so that I could see the truth, and they were never unkind. She knew that she was consistently loved. She mentioned that upon her death, that she was first in a kind of hazy sleep consciousness and eventually came alert. And when she did, the surroundings that she came alert to reminded her of a very well-equipped rehab center, something like a very pleasant clinic with lots of people. And she said they tried many different things from many angles. And she said everything was effective somehow, and that there was never the idea of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. There was no backsliding at all. So it wasn't very long before she had a hope about her healing that she hadn't had in her attempts here to beat an addiction. So she said, I was surprised at how hopeful I was. Isn't that good to hear? I'm listening to this, compassionate response through the lens of so many people I've known, either in my personal life or my life, ministerial life as a priest. Addiction is just so prevalent. Can you think of an extended family that has no story that involves alcoholism or drug abuse of any kind, or some other kind of addiction to food or sex or workaholism? I don't know. Addiction is all over the place in my world anyway. So it's not difficult for me to feel compassion when this story, when I focus on it. I so hope that if you who are viewing and listening this podcast are either in addiction or love someone who is, uh, or someone who's a bystander to someone else's addiction, that you can find hope here. I have. One of the things that she said is, in the course of me moving through effective healing, when people brought up moments and issues where she had some fault, some uh, something objective that she contributed to um, the pain that caused other people. She said, they never shamed me. They only brought up truth in ways that were objectively clear and purposeful. She said, I never felt shamed here, which was a new feeling for her because shame was something that accompanied her. Then she brought up the near-death experience, and within it, the phenomenon that persons in the near-death community call the life review. I'm a member of IANS, the International Association for Near-Death Studies, and many accounts of persons' experiences in a near-death or out-of-body consciousness involve a life review. Very often they describe it as being in some sort of environment where you were floating in love, surrounded by love. And once you understood that you were in an environment where everything was love, there might be a little assembly of people, sometimes religious figures. It could be Jesus for a Christian, but somebody, helpers or deceased relatives, somebody is in this circle of love where you're shown scenes from your life. Ritah said it was like watching a well-produced, well-told version of your own life, that it was entertaining and well-crafted, I think was the phrase she used. In the classic near-death experience life review, people are brought into scenes where they might be shown how they did something or said something in their life that had a ripple effect for the good, that they did something that caused a domino effect, a chain of events in the life of someone around them, that had they not been there and said or done that thing, the other person's life would have been diminished. Conversely, sometimes they're shown scenes from a life where there might have been some offhand, snarky, sarcastic remark that that seemed funny at the time, that landed at the expense of another person, that really wounded them, and that might have had effects later in a negative way. So she said that I was in this scene, or I was shown scenes of my life that had nothing but truth in them, and all of it was brought to me in a loving way. She also mentioned that her guardian angel, Earl, had a great capacity for listening to Ritah in her afterlife repeat a story about herself that she had uh, crafted that wasn't completely true. And he would say something like, "Now, Ritah, uh, that's how you recall that event. Here is how it actually occurred." She said when he would do that, he didn't contradict me in a way that felt like a put down. He loving, and he said, I knew that he loved me, so that he wouldn't say anything that wasn't full of love. He would just say, "This is how it actually occurred. Do you remember this?" So he didn't like take, some high status above her and tell her what's what. He would say a thing and say, "Do you remember that now?" And she often said that when he did that, it very often just made her say, "Oh." And then after that, she would say it usually paused the conversation because the truth that Earl spoke needed to be pondered. That reminded me as a preacher in our form of worship when I'm presiding in a mass and preaching, we'll read from a gospel story. It's usually less than a minute long, maybe 2 minutes, but not long. And there'll be some scene where Jesus is teaching people something, or sometimes in a confrontative exchange, kind of unpleasant exchange. There were a lot of those. And Jesus will say a thing, and then the passage will say something like, "At that, they grew silent. No one asked him any more questions." The truth can land that way sometimes in a way that stops nonsensical back and forth and just has a kind of echoing depth to it. And that's what Rita was describing. She said, sometimes my beloved Earl would be able to just do that. Um, One of the things that they led her to in truth was that they were trying to help her figure out where did her addiction begin. Even like illness in the body, there's so much research that goes on around cancer. When a person it's discovered that they have cancer, how did they get it? Pancreatic cancer, where did that come from? And was it genetic? Is there something in that, or was there something environmental, or whatever? It there oftentimes there's not only one uh, source. There might be a cluster of things converging, culminating in an illness. Well, addiction can be very much like that. It's not necessarily absolutely one thing, but a cluster of things. So it can be difficult to get to the root of uh, why is this at all, and how does one move past it? Well, one of the things that might have seemed as just plain as the nose on your face in her case was a trauma that happened when she was 6 years old. Her sister, Brenda, was only 1 year old or 7 years old. Brenda was riding a bicycle and was struck by a car and killed. Well, that might put a dent in one's life trajectory. It's not that everything is absolutely causal, determinative, but she was brought back to remember what it felt like in the year or so after that. And she said, "I was only 6 years old and I was grieving my sister's death, but my parents were immobilized by it." And she said, as a 6 year old, I had a roof over my head and I was fed and clothed, but I felt like my parents didn't have the emotional capacity to uh, care for my emotions. And she said, at 6, I felt like I had to raise myself inside this shell of a safe home that they created for me. Well, and then she said, I love the way she put this. She said, my parents were just so hollow inside. So she had compassion for them as parents who had endured the sudden loss of a 7 year old. But she said, people in those days weren't taught to talk about their pain. Well, that's a compassionate way to look back She could have just been bitter at her parents for kind of emotional abandonment, but she wasn't. She just said people in those days weren't taught to talk about their pain. Well, one place they were, whenever this might have been in the 60s or 50s, she described that she and her sister never were allowed to wear pants. They only wore dresses. Well, that reminded me of the 50s, or earlier, I suppose. Um, but but even in those decades, with all the trauma going on in the world, with World War I, the Depression, World War II, such broad trauma all over the world, one place where people were learning to talk about their pain that emerged during that period was Alcoholics Anonymous. That great gift to the world of that methodology of going into a circle and speaking your truth in a way that was listened to and respected by others in a healing way. Uh, Maybe that didn't across the board uh, change everything, but I just like the way she said that. People in those days weren't taught to talk about their pain. Well, she said that that wasn't the only cause of her or thing, a contributing cause toward what turned out to be full-blown addiction, but she said it was certainly a big part of it. She said it was a little like a weed. I was thinking of like a dandelion on the lawn that sends out spores, and with a dandelion, you can watch them blow in the breeze, and that seed is brought somewhere else to plant itself. She said, I learned that there were some predispositions that were genetic. Um, there was the event of Brenda's death. She said, I began to see that there was a ripple effect and that this thing that happened over here had this consequence over there. And little by little, things grew in such a way. She said some of it was even just negative um, feedback from people in her youth, people being unnecessarily and unkindly critical. She said, they showed me how this confluence of different little things contributed to pain that eventually was numbed in drug addiction. She said, as I grew in knowledge, a dark cloud lifted. Uh, she said, I began to be able to see the truth of my life in a way that I hadn't ever completely before. I really appreciated that because, I'm a guy who grew up in Texas, and, my childhood was mostly the, late 50s, 60s, and I graduated high school in 74. During those years, there was beginning to be a dawning awakening of the importance of paying attention to one's own story. The human potential movement was blooming in the late 60s and early 70s. There was a lot of attention being paid to one's own story and making sure that it didn't hold you down. But sometimes people would just say, "Oh, stop your whining. That happened years ago." Or get over it. Everybody's got troubles. Nobody wants to listen to that. There can be a kind of a way in which we tamp down uh, other people's attempts to grow in self-knowledge and just call all of it whining. Well, I suppose there's moments when we overdo it and we just sound like whiners. But on the other hand, at least what Rita was telling us is she was never shamed. She was just shown, yes, this did have an effect and it did move from here to there. It wasn't so much blaming other people and being angry with them as it was just coming to truth. Um, I think I'm going to talk more about that in next week's episode about the nature of truth being definitive, that there can be what I think of as sloppy reasoning, where as long as enough people believe a thing is true, it becomes sort of an alternative truth. And I'll deal with that next time. But she really just appreciated that a dark cloud lifted as she came to know the truth of her life, and that a big part of it had a connection to the sudden and violent death of her sister when she was only 6. Um, they told her that as she kept growing and healing, that she compared the process that she was in with us as graduating from a rehab. She also said that she had done that several times, but never because she was healed. it always had to do with money and insurance. There came a limit to how long she could stay in a rehab. She said they just tried to put the best face they could on it and say, look at all the progress you've made, and then showed her to the door. She said, that's not what's happening this time. I really and truly am free, and I'm not under that cloud any longer. And they think I'm ready to be shown a really expansive series of opportunities of what might be next for me. She also said that she was recommended that it not have anything to do with rehab for a while. If she wanted to come back and help other people do that, that's praiseworthy, but they just said, let's not do that just yet. There's lots of other things for you to explore. Well, we'll explore that next time. Next time we'll be in the third part of Ritah's story, what we call spiritual practice. So especially if you love someone who is in addiction or has died of addiction, you'll want to turn in for that episode. I'll be offering some possible spiritual practices that might give you hope and that might be helpful to the person you love, whether they're on this plane or whether they've passed. So for now, this is Father Nathan. I'm grateful that you joined me for this podcast. If you want to be in touch with me, you can do that through my website, nathan-castle.com. Just send me an email, and I'll do my best to try to be back in touch. I do ask that you have read at least one of the books before asking me questions that are explained within them. And remember too that I'm praying for you and for whatever is most important in your heart. So for now, God bless you, and thanks again for being with me. Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Joyful Friar. Please like, follow, and subscribe. You can visit me at nathan-castle.com. Send me a message by clicking the contact button. God bless.